last time. Today we're going to be looking at the oldest civilization in the world, the place where Abraham was born and eventually founded Judaism, the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. In order to understand today's lesson, what we need to remember from previous lessons is how we use the word state in social studies class. So a state, it's a territory with a single political system and a legally defined and protected border. States can take very different forms, but if there is one ruler and a border, it is a state. And I say that because we're going to see today, you can have city-states where it's like one city, like Houston, with its own leader. It's a state. You can have monarchies where there's like a king ruling over several cities. You can have empires. States look very different, but if there's a ruler and a border, you're looking at a state. All right, our do first for Mesopotamia was a little longer, but I did want to practice kind of pulling information out of text. So you guys had a bunch of text to look at, and my first question for y'all was, what did we learn about Mesopotamia? The first civilization, what inventions come from Mesopotamia? One historian calls them the greatest inventors of all time. So in the chat, let's see pictures or words or school appropriate GIFs for the inventions of Mesopotamia that you found in the text. Ooh, nice. Got clocks, calendars, wheels, written records, law. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a poem. Wheel, calendar, clock. Good job, everybody. And Caesar, Jesus did not come from Mesopotamia. You are incorrect. Yeah, no, they were ready. Maybe you guys can get this next one, because I think you guys got the vast majority of them. The second paragraph was about like how geography affected Mesopotamia. And here I want us to use our Houston brains, where we know that sometimes it floods and sometimes we can't predict it, and we know what that does to our lives. So think about what it might be like to live in a place in between two rivers where flooding was unpredictable and disastrous, often destroying city-states in an instant. How might that affect the worldview of people of Mesopotamia, how they saw the world? Let's see. First, Isabella says, since it's disastrous, it can cause people to go homeless. That's true. That is very true. We know that all too well in Houston, for sure. God, they might have thought the flooding is so dangerous it might bring the end of the world. Absolutely. Great job, Caesar. Probably. And there are probably some really cool stories and myths that we can find. If only they had a big boat. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about then. Good job. Yes. Anything else? So like, sometimes it's hard to put into words. Edward says no one will live near there. And it turns out that like people did. It's just, it wasn't quite the stable civilizations that Egypt had, right? People did live there, but it wasn't always the same state, and that is the big difference. All right, and here's a thought for you guys to keep in the back of your heads and kind of chew on as we go through class today. Today we're going to be looking at the very first code of law that we have access to. So like, what is law, right? It's rules that a society lives by, set by powerful people in society. So my thought for you, think about whether this is still true or not. People with the power to make laws that benefit people with enough power to make laws. And with that, let's look at Mesopotamia, assuming my PowerPoint slide will change. Okay, so like setting the scene, right? Mesopotamia, the very first civilization, the land between the rivers, the Fertile Crescent, whatever you want to call it. It's in modern day Iraq. And if you look at the map on the bottom left, you can kind of see where those two rivers were, right? The Tigris and Euphrates rivers stretched across that little strip of land, the Fertile Crescent, and made it fertile because both of those rivers flooded And when those rivers flooded, it brought nutrients to the land, which helped farming. Unlike Egypt, though, these two rivers did not flood on a schedule, annoyingly, and they weren't very chill. They flooded pretty violently and pretty disastrously. So, although they often provided a lot of food, sometimes they brought disaster. We can see a lot of art from Mesopotamia that's really, really fun to look at. And one of the cooler things about Mesopotamia is that, unlike Egypt, where it was just one state the whole time, Mesopotamia was home to like several different similar civilizations, partially because they kept getting invaded all the time. The things that you are looking at that probably look the coolest on the slide came from an empire called Babylon that formed in Mesopotamia, and Hammurabi was the king, and we're going to be looking at his law code that came from there. All right, so please prepare to take notes. These are our key points for the day. And let's look deep at Mesopotamia, the world's very first civilization. Mesopotamia is located in modern-day Iraq in the Middle East, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And Mesopotamia was home to lots of different states over time. You're probably reference to Sumer in your readings. That was a group of city-states, so like cities that have their own leader, that have a border that they protect, so a city that is a state also. It was also home to the Empire of Babylon. Remember, an empire is a civilization that takes over other civilizations and rules over them and keeps their land. The thing we want to look at with Mesopotamia is how these early civilizations first established control and order over increasingly large territory. It's one thing to be like the ruler of a little village where you can see everybody and everybody can see you. It's another thing to be king of a land that stretches far beyond, where you can like actually see or even feel. So how did they work that out? That's the question. And we also want to keep in mind how physical geography affected the development of this civilization. Remember, yesterday we saw that Egypt had a pretty sweet setup. It had a river that was plentiful, that was easy to get up and down, that flooded on a schedule, very chill. And it was protected by deserts, so it was hard to invade. Mesopotamia was like the opposite. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamians were subject to violent, unpredictable flooding, which led them to kind of have a more sort of chaotic and dark kind of worldview. At the same time, Mesopotamia was flat. There were no natural barriers for Mesopotamia, and so it was super easy to invade. I was reading last night, like if you stand on a phone book in Mesopotamia, you can improve your visibility by like 10 miles. It's like super, super, super flat. And there's no giant desert protecting it. So because it was easy to invade, it was invaded often. And so it was home to several different states, kind of politically unstable. So you can see how geographic instability kind of leads to political instability, which I think is pretty interesting. The thing we're going to focus on the most today is listed under distinctive details in that very last row, because the Mesopotamians were the greatest inventors of all time. They invented writing. We think that like writing came out of trade. So like when you trade, you need to keep records at some point, leading to the invention of cuneiform. It's hard to see on this slide. I think there's a bigger picture on the next slide, but like basically they pressed little notches into clay tablets, and that was the very first form of writing, and we still have some. Writing turns out to have been a little key of its own. Writing doesn't only give us history, although now we have history instead of prehistory, so that's nice. But writing allows people to have written laws, like rules for society coming from the king, and in theory from God, according to the king. And as soon as you have written laws, you can expand the power of the state territorially far and wide. Right? You can have centralized, uniform control over large territories. Centralized means one person makes decisions centrally, from like a capital city usually. And uniform control means everybody follows the same written laws no matter where they are, in theory. So, having writing alone is very helpful. Having written laws alone can help you run a state or empire. But the way those laws are written turns out to be pretty key too. Our first code of law, very much like other codes of law from its time period, were very clear about keeping the social hierarchy the way that it is, protecting the power of the people on top, keeping power from the people on the bottom. And we'll see this in Hammurabi's code, the law code we're about to read, when we see that people of different classes and genders had different values and rights. I want you guys to think about how much this is still true as we kind of go through today's lesson and the class and as you guys are watching the news. The very first law code that we have record of, as you'll see, has laws that protect government and church power pretty explicitly. They protect property. They distinguish between upper class and lower class people. And they treat women as property. If anyone can remember the big fancy word for treating women like property and put it in the chat, I will be super impressed. The law codes that we are talking about, it's not specialization, is called Hammurabi's Code. Patriarchy, good job, Caesar. Patriarchy is the system where men have all power and women don't. Good job. Where was I? Right, Hammurabi's Code is what this first law code is. You will see it by name because it's pretty famous. And you'll see that it reinforces the social hierarchy because punishment for the same crime will be different depending on the class and gender of the victim and the offender. People are weird. All right, so today we're going to be looking at our very first primary source, and I want to set us up to do that. If you didn't finish getting notes on the key points, don't you worry. I stuck them in your OneNote. I can put them back up in a minute. But I do want to talk to you guys about how to read primary sources. We know that history starts when writing is invented, and that when we look at anything created in the past that we're studying, we're looking at a primary source. We also know that our primary sources are not complete reflections of the past. First, they're usually written by people who have enough power to leave written sources to begin with. That means, rulers, literate people, men usually. And if we're looking at a conflict, usually whoever wins that conflict writes that history. So primary sources can be diaries. Like usually people don't write letters to people in the future. We're looking at like documents that people create in the course of their own lives. Diaries, law codes, trade records, official documents, all kinds of stuff. But that kind of stuff is usually created by people with enough power to both put any thoughts into writing and to preserve that writing for long enough for us to get a hold of it. This leaves out the vast majority, actually, of people who live on Earth. Women didn't tend to leave primary sources for most of history. Slaves, The illiterate, anyone who is conquered, anyone without enough power to write a source, nomadic populations, right? All of them tend to be silent in the historical record. And so when we look at primary sources, we have to both think about what they do tell us and at the same time what they don't tell us. Whose point of view are we looking at? What does it tell us about the society? And whose voices are missing? And how can we try to find them? I put up the summary of Hammurabi's code on the left of the slide here in case you guys are still copying notes. But in order to fully get today's lesson, we have to also remember that rulers didn't just come out with laws and say, like, I'm the king, so you have to follow my rules, and that's the end of it. Usually, laws, like political power, were connected to some sort of divine origin or religious origin for legitimacy, and so people follow the rules. So we'll see that at the top of Hammurabi's code, actually. In the middle of the slide, you'll see, like, it says relief of Hammurabi and the god Shamash. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But this is at the very top of the law code. So you can see like government power and religious power working hand in hand already, as though these laws came down from a religious source. Hammurabi himself was part of a dynasty, so a ruling family that had conquered Mesopotamia and created the Babylonian Empire. And he ruled like forever ago, from 1792 to 1750 BCE, which like back then was a really, really long time to be alive and to rule. And he united all of Mesopotamia under one empire. So how did he do that? How does this law code help? And what can we tell about society by looking at it? When we think critically about sources in history, and I hope that you bring this habit into your life and think critically just in general, we do a lot of sourcing work, which means looking at who wrote the source and how that affects what it says. What's the point of view? To do this, there's no like one single formula, right? But like the very first thing to do is to look at the author and the date. So like who wrote it? Is it a king? Is it a slave? Slaves tended not to leave written sources, but you know what I mean. And then based on that, what does it say about their point of view? You also have to look at what kind of source it is. Is it a personal diary? Is it a law code? Trade records? The kind of source will tell you what kind of information it should expect and what part of society it clarifies. And then as always in life, as in history, think about bias, and not necessarily as like a bad thing, just a human thing, right? Given the author and the context of when sources were created, what kinds of biases should we expect the source to contain? Right, Hammurabi's code is actually written on this big thing in the middle of the slide. And there's some detail on the left so you can see what the writing looked like. You don't have to write any of the stuff on this slide down. I just kind of want you to look at the pictures. This law code is a collection of 282 rules, which sounds like a lot, but it's not compared to modern law codes. And it has standards for all kinds of stuff like trade. It sets fines and punishments for like small crimes and big crimes. And we still have it, which I think is pretty amazing. And with this law code, he ruled over all of Mesopotamia. All right, so let's practice looking at one law from Hammurabi's code. Let's see how much we can get out of it. And then I will leave you guys to explore in the OneNote and solve the mysteries of like under what circumstances we can throw women into rivers to punish a different man for his crime. Anyway, all right, so I'm going to read the law. You guys think about what inferences you can make about the society, about what it values, and what it protects. So like see how much you can squeeze out of this source. Law 8. If a man has stolen an ox, a sheep, a pig, or a boat that belonged to a temple or a palace, he shall repay 30 times its cost. If it belonged to a private citizen, he shall repay 10 times. If the thief cannot pay, he shall be put to death. So, in the chat, show me what you got. Tell me anything that you can infer about this society based on that law. What is it valuing? What is it protecting? Do you see the social hierarchy being enforced here somewhere? You can drop any inferences in the chat. Like, some things we can start to think about are like, what is being protected? Isabella says lower class citizens get punishments for literally the smallest things, and Caesar says they valued religion and government more than people since the punishment is greater. If you steal from a temple or a palace, you get a bigger punishment than if you steal from any old person. So they're protecting the temple and the palace more. Okay, so that alone tells you a lot. Caesar also adds that they don't value life. And Freedom adds they value their animals and their social hierarchy as if someone who lived in the temple had to get paid more than the lowest citizens. Great job. Y'all are doing great. So yeah, you guys got that it's like preserving the power structure. And Isabella says, well, you take a fruit and you die. Great. I mean, not great. I don't want people killed for taking fruits, but you guys are definitely getting the right idea. So like, one, it's protecting ox, sheep, a pig, boats, stuff that you need to like trade and eat back in the day, right? So like property is important to the society. And the specific property that they're worried about has a lot to do with agriculture and food and the ability to trade, because you can use a boat to go on the river, right? And as you guys noted, the temple and the palace, so like religion and the king, are protected way more than the average person. And as you guys noted, a punishment can be death. Could people just frame someone else from the lower class with no evidence? Asks Caesar, and I would guess so. Yes, probably. I imagine that happens all the time in history. One thing that you guys picked up on too is like the consequence being death. And here is like one of the fun things about studying history is you get to like emote with these people in the past who like breathed and thought things kind of like you do, but under totally different circumstances and totally different rules. As you go through the law code today, you'll notice that the punishment for a lot of things is death. And that's pretty typical of until really recently in history, if you take the long view of history, right? Reasons for that vary. One of them is people tend to follow rules if the consequences are pretty severe, right? So like if the consequence for not taking notes in my class were death, I bet everybody would be taking notes. At the moment, there is no consequence other than my mild disapproval. So like probably some people are getting away with with not doing it. But the intensity definitely kind of helps you keep control over stuff. You also have to remember that like the ability to physically protect yourself was very limited to lower class people who didn't own weapons, who didn't know how to fight if they had them. Like you can't just hold a sword and like have it work. You actually have to know what you're doing. So power structures were real and they were pretty intense in the past in a way that they're just not as much anymore. Although, if you watch the news, you might argue with that last statement. I'm arguing with myself right now. Okay, so questions. Any questions before I let you guys into this? If not, today you guys are doing 3.09 in your OneNote. The first half of that is about Mesopotamia as a civilization, our oldest civilization, right? So there's a video that you guys can watch. If you watch a video, you can skip the text in red. But then about halfway down the page, you'll see primary source, the Code of Hammurabi. I do want everybody to read that source, because these laws are a great place to use your imagination. Like, as you read the source, notice your modern reactions to what would have been very normal in this ancient law. And note that when they talk about throwing people into rivers, that was probably a death sentence. So that's all in 3.09 in your OneNote. I have a question about who conquered Mesopotamia. The answer is like many people over time conquered Mesopotamia, but after the time period we're looking at, I believe it was the Persian Empire